Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to do is talk about message batching in Azure Logic Apps consumption skew. This is part 2, and we're going to focus on partitions in this specific video. Let's go. Alright, so as mentioned, this is video 2 of a 2-part series, so if you haven't seen part 1, would recommend you checking that out. I'll put a link in the description of this video, but I'm not going to go through everything that I did in the first video, so please check that out. Now, what we want to focus on in this video is essentially like sub-batches or batches within a batch. And this feature is officially known as partitions inside of Azure Logic Apps and helps us with the grouping of messages, and in some ways could also help us with processing order as well. So if we had, say, a series of orders coming in and there was a common order ID and perhaps we wanted to organize those by order ID, that's something that we can actually go ahead and do with partitions. And you specify the partition essentially on publishing when you're sending a message to the batch, and then what you're doing is basically operating within that batch. And so you only need to create one batch inside of Logic Apps from a receiver perspective, but we've got like these logical groupings within the batch itself. So let's go ahead, let's dive deeper into this subject. All right, a little bit more info from docs.microsoft.com. So inside of a batch sender, we can specify a unique partition key that divides the target batch into logical subsets where you can send messages. Each set has a unique number that's generated by the batch sender logic app. This capability gives you a single batch with multiple subsets and define each subset with the name you provide. And so similar rules apply in terms of like limits or throughputs. And here we've got a partition can have up to 5,000 messages or 80 megs. If either condition is met, Logic Apps may release the batch even when your defined release condition isn't met. So that's something to be aware of as well. So our scenario here, we've got a sender that could be incrementally publishing messages. And then in our logic app, basically our batch logic app, we're going to separate these into multiple partitions. So here it's just going to be partition 1 and partition 2, just for illustrative purposes. And then we're going to debatch, and when we debatch, we're going to find that we'll debatch based on partitions and the criteria being met for the partition, not for the batch. And so that's kind of the key point here, and I've kind of emphasized this below. The partition 1 and partition 2 batches will be processed independent of each other. And we're going to see this in the demo. So just to add a little bit more flavor to this, here we've got our sender. And as part of our sender, we can go ahead and specify our partition name. And so here, like, this is where you can use your dynamic content or expressions and go ahead and provide that partition name. So you know, if you were processing orders, maybe order ID would be a good one. Maybe if you were dealing with customers, customers ID would be a good one. These are screenshots from the docs pages, and here they're just using a random value to illustrate the purpose. That's fine. And then we can go ahead and when we receive our batch, access this information. So if we wanted to know which partition we were processing, we would have the ability to retrieve that from our dynamic content as well. So let's go ahead, let's see a demo. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have 2 partitions. So I'm going to basically send a bunch of messages with partition 1, and we're going to see those processed. And basically, concurrently, I'm going to send messages for partition 2, but not enough to satisfy the release requirements. And so what we're going to see is the partition 1 messages are going to be processed right away, and then the partition 2 messages will be processed after basically the time frame for our release schedule has been met. So let's dive into the portal and see how this works. All right, so similar demo to last week, but I'll quickly go through it. So we've got 3 logic apps. This one is our logic app batch subscriber. You do need to create this logic app first because you won't be able to push to a batch until that batch is created. And so what I've done here is I've got a batch trigger. I'm using inline. There's also the ability to use the integration account. Mark Brimble has a good blog post on that. I'll include it in the description if you want to see that. He's called out some nuances with the integration account, and that's worth noting. Here I've called my batch name batch demo, and I've got sort of two different release criteria. So one is message count. So if I receive 10 messages for a batch, I will go ahead and process that batch. Or I've got an interval of 3 minutes. And obviously this is for demo purposes, but this could be much longer if you wanted it to be so. So whichever condition is met first, the batch will get executed based upon that. Then what I just do is I just loop through, and I will push a message to a compose just so that we can see it in the run history. And within this message, we'll be able to see the partition ID that was used for that interface. So that's our subscriber. Then we're going to have basically our batch publisher. And so this is my second logic app, and I'm just going to pull messages from a queue, and I'm going to then just do some parse JSON around it. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and publish it to our batch. And as part of that, I've got parse JSON here on purpose so that I can go ahead and look at my partition value. And so whatever, I'm just pulling right from the message itself. So any sort of expression will work if you want to basically break up your messages by some sort of value in your message payload. So that's basically logic app number 2. And then logic app number 3 is more of my test hardness. All I'm going to do here is run my recurrence, and then I'm going to loop. And I'm going to go ahead and create 5 messages and just increment my variable. So we'll send 5 messages. In this case, I've got it hard-coded partition 1. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this logic app twice. Then I'm going to come in here, I'm going to modify partition 1 to say partition 2, and then I'm going to run it again, and then we'll look at the behavior in our subscriber. So let's go ahead and let's kick this off. So I will run this twice, as I mentioned. So that's once, that's twice. Let's refresh. And we've got 2 messages that were sent. This will result in 10 messages being received from our logic app, our second logic app. And then we've got 10. And then if we flip over to our batch and we refresh this, we can see that we've processed those messages. And if we open this up, we see that we've got 10 messages. And if we just iterate through them, we can see that they are all partition 1. So that's great. Now what happens if we go in and change our test tool? And in this case, we're going to go ahead and say partition 2. And then let's make things a little bit interesting. Let's go ahead and then send those 2 batches in for partition 1. We'll send 2 back to back. And we should see those processed faster than the partition 2 because those requirements would have been met sooner. So let's come back over here, refresh. Here we've got a message that's been processed, and we can see it's partition 1. So let's go back to our run history. Let's refresh again. So now if we go ahead and look at it, we should see partition 2. And notice that we just have 5 messages here. And so what happened was the partitions get processed independently, as I mentioned in the slides. So when I sent in 2 runs of 5 messages each for partition 1, that satisfied our first requirement of message count of 10. And so that got processed right away. Now the secondary or the additional threshold that we have is time bound. And in my case, it was 3 minutes. And so what happened was that I didn't have the 10 messages as a threshold, but I did have time. And so after 3 minutes of waiting, then this partition got picked up. And so kind of the net of this is that partitions do run independent of each other. Okay, so that concludes another episode on the channel. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Next week we'll talk about something else, but I thought it would be worthwhile just talking about message batching. I hadn't taken a deep look into this feature in the past, so I thought it was a good opportunity. If you are not following me on Twitter, go ahead and find me at Weirzy. Likes, subscribes, comments, always welcome on YouTube. Thanks and take care. Bye.